the unraveling. Elena's hand was around Mark's throat, her nails digging into the skin above his carotid artery. And for the first time in 3 months, she felt the weight of something solid beneath her fingers, something real and killable. But the police were already in the hallway. The doorbell had saved her life, or perhaps it had only delayed the inevitable. 13 hours earlier, that morning had begun like any other. The kind of morning that makes you believe nothing will change, that the architecture of your life is permanent and unshakable. Elena's hand swept across the mahogany console table, moving the stack of unopened mail to one side. The utility bill on top bore Mark's name in bold black ink. Mark Vane. She was looking for her car keys. The ceramic key bowl sat empty, its glazed interior reflecting the harsh morning light that poured through the high windows of their minimalist hallway. The dust motes danced in that light like living things, and she watched them for a fraction of a second before her eyes began to dart. Scanning the table's surface for the silver keyring she was certain she had placed there last night. The dry shuffle of paper against wood filled the silence as she moved bills from left to right, right to left. Nothing. From the kitchen doorway, Mark leaned against the frame with an almost theatrical casualness. His gray cashmere sweater hung loose across his shoulders, and he held a black ceramic mug to his lips. He didn't drink from it immediately. Instead, he watched Elena's frantic movements without blinking, his head tilted at an angle that suggested mild amusement. The clink of the mug meeting his teeth came like punctuation to her searching. His shadow stretched long across the hallway floor, reaching toward her like a dark hand. Lost something again, Elena? His voice was soft, patronizing, the kind of voice a parent might use with a child who had disappointed them for the 100th time. You really need to be more organized. Elena dropped to her knees on the polished hardwood floor. The wood was cold through the fabric of her pajama pants, and she could feel splinters catching on the worn cotton as she moved. Her arm swept under the console table into the darkness beneath it, searching through the cold, empty space. Her fingers touched only polished wood and dust. There was a spider web in the corner, its occupant long gone, and she felt the gossamer threads catch on her skin as her hand moved deeper into the shadows. I put them right here, Mark. I specifically remember the sound they made hitting the bowl last night. Her voice had climbed into her throat, becoming high and fragile. I always put them in that bowl. Mark walked toward her slowly. His footsteps were measured, deliberate, each one a small announcement of his approach. When he was close enough, he reached into his right pants pocket and withdrew a silver keyring with a leather fob. He held it up between them, and as he shook the keys, they made a bright, metallic jingle that filled the hallway. They were in the freezer, Elena. The keys caught the light, throwing small reflections across the walls and ceiling. Are you feeling okay? This memory thing is getting worse. Elena stood quickly, her kneecaps throbbing from the hardwood. Without thinking, driven by something primal and desperate, she lunged for the keys in Mark's hand. But Mark was faster. He pulled his hand back with a sharp motion, and before she could adjust her trajectory, his other hand was already moving. She felt the impact against her chest. A firm, deliberate shove that sent her stumbling backward into the wall behind her. The back of her head cracked against the plaster, and for a moment, the world tilted. She recovered faster than she had before. Her hand shot out and grabbed Mark's wrist, twisting it in the direction that made the joint scream. She could feel his bones moving under the skin, felt him resisting her. And then his left hand came up and tangled into her hair. He yanked downward with shocking force, pulling her head down and forward. She gasped, her body folding in on itself, and without conscious thought, her nails found his forearm. She dug them in deep, raking them down the length of his skin, drawing thin red lines of blood that beaded up like rubies on his tanned forearm. The cloth of his sweater tore as they grappled, and she could feel the strained tendons in his neck flex against her body as he bent lower, trying to get leverage. The world had narrowed to just the two of them and the violence that lived between them. Mark threw the keys across the room. They traveled through the air in a glittering arc, and when they struck the framed mirror on the opposite wall, the glass exploded outward in a cascade of fractured light. The sound was like a gunshot, sudden, violent, final. Elena fell against the mahogany table, gasping for air, her lungs burning. The back of her thighs hit the hard wood edge, and she gripped it with both hands to keep from falling further. "Look at what you made me do." Mark's voice was perfectly calm now, stripped of all emotion and all mercy. "You're hysterical, Elena. You aren't going anywhere in this state." He turned and walked back toward the kitchen, leaving her alone in the hallway surrounded by shattered glass that caught the morning light and threw it in 1,000 directions at once. That night, 11:30 p.m. The street lamp outside their living room window flickered on and off in a stuttering rhythm that had driven Elena nearly insane by the time she sat on the navy velvet sofa with a seam ripper in her trembling hands. She was cutting open the decorative pillow that Mark had given her just a week ago, the one with the gold thread worked into an intricate pattern, the one he'd seemed so proud of when he placed it in her hands and smiled that smile of his that never quite reached his eyes. The seam ripper was small and sharp, and she worked it carefully along the stitching, snipping through each tiny knot one by one. The snip of the threads breaking was the only sound in the apartment besides the periodic hum of the refrigerator. Yellow stuffing began to spill out as she worked, collecting in small piles on the sofa cushion. Her fingers found the device almost by accident. It was small, rectangular, no larger than a thumb drive, and it was made of black plastic that had picked up a fine coating of dust from its hiding place. A tiny green light blinked on its side with methodical precision. One blink, 1 second of darkness, one blink, repeating in an endless cycle. Elena's hands began to tremble. She found the tiny headphone jack and plugged in her earbuds. The device was some kind of recorder. She understood that immediately. And when she pressed play, she heard her own voice crying to her mother. The conversation was from 2 days ago. She could remember exactly where she'd been sitting, which corner of the kitchen, how the afternoon light had turned everything gold. She'd been telling her mother about Mark's behavior, about how he'd moved her car keys and then insisted she'd imagined putting them on the table in the first place. Her voice on the recording sounded small and frightened. And then, at the end of the file, underneath her voice like a shadow underneath a body, she heard Mark. He wasn't in the room during the call. She would have seen him, would have heard the catch in his breathing or the shift of his weight. But his voice was clear anyway, whispered directly into the recorder like a confession meant only for her ears. She's so easy to break. Elena sat frozen on the sofa, the earbuds still in place, that single sentence repeating in her mind. She heard the key turn in the front door. She heard Mark's footsteps on the welcome mat in the hallway. She pulled the recorder out of her pocket and pushed it down between the sofa cushions, moving the yellow stuffing from the pillow over the spot to conceal it. Her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely pick up the hardcover book from the coffee table, The Silent Patient, and open it to a random page. She forced her breathing to even out, forced her eyes to fix on the words, even though they were meaningless squiggles, forced her body into the shape of someone who was simply reading on a quiet night. Mark's shadow entered the hallway, and she heard him setting down his keys. The real keys, she thought. Not the ones from the freezer, not the ones that had fallen from his hand this morning, on the console table beside the empty key bowl. The restaurant was dimly lit, and the red leather of the booth seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Elena slid in across from Sarah and Mark, who were sitting close together, their shoulders nearly touching, looking at something on Sarah's phone screen. They pulled apart as she approached, but not quite quickly enough. There was a moment, just a fraction of a second, where Elena saw the intimacy between them. Not romantic, but intimate in a different way. The way two people are intimate when they share a secret. Low jazz music played from hidden speakers, and ambient chatter filled the spaces between tables. Wine glasses sweated condensation onto the white tablecloth. Sarah reached across the table and placed her hand over Elena's. Her expression was one of pity rather than warmth, and there were wrinkles around her eyes that Elena didn't remember being there before. They'd been friends for 7 years since college, and suddenly Elena was cataloging all the ways that Sarah looked like a stranger. Mark told me about the mirror, Elena. Sarah's voice was soft and condescending, the kind of voice used in hospitals and funeral homes. Why didn't you tell me you were struggling this much? Elena tried to speak, but Mark was already moving. He slid a small white bottle of pills across the white tablecloth toward her. The label read, Elena Vane, for anxiety. Take as needed. The plastic rattled as it traveled across the smooth surface. You forgot your meds this afternoon. Mark's tone was gentle, fatherly, as if he were speaking to a child who had made a small mistake. That's why you were so confused about the keys, remember? Elena pushed the bottle back. She looked at Sarah, trying to find something familiar in her best friend's face, some fragment of recognition. But Sarah's eyes were fixed on Mark's wrist. On the bruises there, the scratches she'd left. Elena's own fingernails had done that damage, had torn through skin and left marks that would take days to fade. Sarah, he's lying. I found a recorder in the house. Elena's voice was breaking, fragments of desperation showing through. He's recording. Sarah shook her head and pulled her hand away. She looked at Mark and then back at Elena and sighed a long, disappointed sigh. Outside, the rain had begun to blur the windows, and Mark's reflection in the glass was smiling. Recorders? Elena, this is getting paranoid. Maybe you should take the month off work. Sarah didn't meet her eyes when she said it. She was looking at the wine in her glass instead, watching the condensation bead and run down the outside of the stem. Elena burst through the heavy brass restaurant doors and ran onto the rain-slicked sidewalk. She had no coat, and within seconds she was soaked through, her clothes clinging to her skin like a second body. Her heels clicked rapidly against the concrete, the sound sharp and staccato, announcing her presence to everyone on the dark street. The rain drummed on metal trash cans with a sound like distant gunfire, and the city lights blurred in the downpour, turning into watercolor streaks of yellow and red. Behind her, Mark emerged from the restaurant. He didn't run. He walked with a predator's pace, each stride long and measured, eating up the distance between them with the patience of something that knows its prey cannot escape. He held a black umbrella over his head, and the fabric stretched tight against the metal frame, creating a small dome of dryness in the storm. His footsteps were heavy and methodical. Thump, thump, thump. The sound of inevitability itself. Elena ducks into a narrow alley between a brick warehouse and a bistro. The darkness there was absolute, pressing in on her from all sides. She was moving too fast, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and when her heel caught on an iron grate, she lost her footing entirely. She fell forward, her palms slamming into the concrete hard enough to skin them. There was water pooled in the alley, oily water mixed with rainwater, and she felt it soak into her clothes as she hit the ground. She wanted to scream, but her breath was stolen by pain and fear and the simple, overwhelming knowledge that Mark was now in the alley behind her. Mark entered the alley and closed his umbrella slowly. He grabbed Elena by the shoulders of her silk blouse and hauled her up off the ground, pinning her against the rough brick wall. The silk tore under his grip, and she felt it give way, felt the fabric separate from itself. His face was inches from hers, and rain dripped off his nose onto her cheek. "Where were you going?" His voice was a low, vibrating hiss that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside his chest. "You're making a scene, Elena. You're embarrassing us." Elena brought her knee up sharply, driving it into Mark's groin with all the force she could muster. The impact sent a grunt of pain through him, and his grip slackened just enough. She used both palms to shove his chest, pushing hard, and he staggered backward into a stack of wooden pallets. They splintered under his weight, the sound like kindling breaking, and he fell among the debris with a curse. Elena turned and sprinted toward the other end of the alley. Behind her, Mark was already pulling himself up, already in motion. But she was moving on adrenaline and desperation. She reached a chain-link fence and grabbed the cold metal with her bleeding hands. The fence rattled beneath her weight as she began to climb, her feet kicking against the mesh, her fingers finding purchase in the gaps between links. She was hyperventilating now, pulling in air that tasted like rain and rust, and she didn't look back. Elena was inside her silver Honda with the doors locked. She was breathing into her hands to warm them, watching the fog from her breath collect on the windows before evaporating again. The parking lot was empty, except for a few cars scattered across the asphalt like abandoned toys. She reached under the driver's seat to find a charging cable, her fingers brushing over lost change and a granola bar wrapper from months ago. Her hand brushed something cold and magnetic. She yanked it away from the metal seat rail, and the adhesive released with a small click. It was a GPS tracker, no larger than a pack of gum, with a glowing blue active light on its surface. Elena stared at the device for a long moment, turning it over in her hands like a small, poisonous creature. She opened the glove compartment looking for a flashlight, but instead pulled out a folded yellow document she'd never seen before. It was an insurance paper for the car. She unfolded it with shaking hands and began to read. The name on the document wasn't Mark Vane. It was Marcus Vance. Underneath the name was a stamp in red ink. Parolee registration, State of Illinois. She read the name aloud to herself, watching her lips form the syllables. Marcus Vance. On the back of the document was a mugshot clipped with a paperclip. A photo of Mark with a different hair color, a different face that was somehow still entirely recognizable. This was the real face, she thought. This was the one underneath the mask. A headlight flash hit her rearview mirror. A black SUV had pulled into the lot behind her, its high beams pointing directly at her car like accusatory fingers. She looked at the GPS tracker in her hand.
And then at the SUV, and understood. He'd been following her the entire time, watching her movements on the map, seeing where she went, whom she spoke to. The signal from the device in her hand had led him straight to her in every moment.
When she thought she was alone, she fumbled for the ignition, her hands shaking so badly that the keys nearly fell from her grip. Elena crept into the dark apartment, her shoes in her hand. She used the light from her phone to navigate the hallway, casting a thin beam of illumination that cut through the darkness like a knife. Her footsteps were silent on the hardwood floor, and she kept her breathing shallow and controlled. When she reached the bedroom, she paused in the doorway, afraid of what she would find. Mark was sitting in the armchair in the corner, fully dressed, watching her with an expression of perfect calm. On the bed behind him lay her passport, shredded into hundreds of tiny blue and gold pieces. The eagle on the cover was severed in half, its wings spread across the comforter like the remnants of something that had been destroyed. Mark stood up slowly. He walked to the wall calendar and picked up a thick red marker. He circled a date 3 days from today, June 14th, with broad, deliberate strokes of the marker across the paper. The squeak of the marker on paper was the only sound in the room besides their breathing. "That's the day we move," Mark said, his voice perfectly matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing something as simple as a grocery trip. "To the mountain cabin, away from all these distractions that are making you so sick." Elena backed away toward the door, but Mark was faster. He reached the door first and locked it with a sharp click. He pocketed the key with the same unhurried movement. His hand covered the entire knob, making it an inaccessible thing. The trapped air in the bedroom suddenly felt very thin. The basement was windowless and cold and damp, the air hanging heavy with the smell of concrete and old water. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting sharp shadows into every corner. Elena was sitting on a stack of moving boxes, her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped around her shins. She'd been here since that morning, when Mark had led her downstairs and closed the heavy steel door behind her. The bolt had slid home from the outside with a sound like a jail cell slamming shut. She was hunched over, her eyes red from crying. Her throat was hoarse from screaming, and there was no one to hear it anyway. A single pipe dripped somewhere in the shadows. Drip, drip, drip. A sound that had become the soundtrack to her imprisonment. The date was exactly 1 week after the date on the photograph. She sat back on the boxes, holding the clipping in both hands, and felt something inside her crystallize into a shape that wasn't quite terror and wasn't quite clarity. It was something harder than both of those things. Elena was standing on a crate, using a rusted orange pipe wrench to bash the hinges of the high, small basement window. Her muscles were straining, and sweat was running down her temples, soaking into her hair. The metal-on-metal clang of the wrench hitting the hinges echoed through the basement, and she could feel the rust flakes falling into her hair, staining her skin a deep orange. The steel door flew open. Mark stood there with a tray of food, and when he saw her at the window, his entire body went rigid. He dropped the tray, and the ceramic plate shattered on the concrete, sending fragments skittering across the floor. Spilled soup pooled around the broken pieces like blood. Mark lunged at her. Elena swung the pipe wrench wildly, not aiming, not thinking, just moving on pure survival instinct. The wrench caught Mark across the collarbone, and the impact sent a sickening crack through the basement air. Mark clutched his shoulder and roared in pain, but he didn't stop coming. He tackled her off the crate, and they fell together onto the cold floor. Her back hit the crates, and the wind was knocked from her lungs. Mark's hands found her throat, his thumbs digging into her windpipe, pressing down with lethal intent. Elena could feel the pressure building in her head, could feel her vision starting to narrow into a dark tunnel. Her flailing hand found a shard of the broken ceramic plate. Without hesitation, without thought, she jammed it into Mark's thigh. He screamed, a sound of pure animal pain, and rolled off her, clutching his leg as blood soaked his jeans. The ceramic shard stuck out of the fabric like a flag, and when Elena rolled away from him, she gasped for air, her lungs burning, her throat raw. Elena was tied to a heavy oak dining chair with nylon rope. Her face was bruised, and she was shivering despite the warmth of the apartment around her. The TV was on in the background, showing a news report, but she couldn't hear the words anymore. Her wrists were raw from the rope, and when she moved even slightly, the nylon dug deeper into her skin. Mark was limping, his leg heavily bandaged. He held his phone up to Elena's face and played a video. It was the hallway from the first morning, the morning with the keys. But it had been edited. In the video, Elena was attacking Mark unprovoked, her hands around his throat, her face twisted with rage. Her own screams played under the edited footage like a soundtrack to her own violence. I already showed this to the police. Mark's voice was a whisper directly into her ear, close enough that she could smell his breath. They're looking for you, to bring you to a psychiatric hold. Nobody will believe a word you say now. Mark walked to the drawer and pulled out a syringe. He tapped the side of it, and a clear liquid squirted from the needle. He was methodical about it, calm, completely unhurried. He held the syringe up to the light, watching the liquid catch the glow. The doorbell rang. Mark froze. He looked at the door, and then back at Elena. He pressed his finger to his lips in a gesture that was almost playful, a demand for silence dressed up as a game. The loud, mechanical double chime of the doorbell sounded again, and then a third time. "Police, open up!" a voice called from the hallway. Mark went to the door. Elena worked her hands through the rope, feeling the nylon give slightly as she moved. She had hidden the sharp edge of the gold-threaded pillow in her waistband after she'd torn it open looking for the recorder. Now she maneuvered it into her hands and began to work it against the nylon binding her wrists. The pillow contained the hidden recorder, and when Mark's attention was on the door, Elena used her fingernails to find the button, the one that would activate the playback. She pressed it. The loudspeaker came to life at maximum volume, and the apartment filled with the sound of Mark's voice from the recorded conversation. "She's so easy to break." The hallway fell silent. Elena pressed harder against the rope, feeling the nylon begin to fray under the pressure of the pillow's edge. The recorder kept playing, Mark's voice echoing through the apartment like an accusation. The visitor's voice outside became more urgent. "Open the door! We have a warrant!" Mark rushed back toward the recorder, his face contorted with rage. Elena, having loosened the rope enough that her hands could move slightly, kicked the coffee table into his path. The legs of the table screeched against the floor, and Mark tripped over the edge, falling hard. Elena broke free of the remaining rope. She sprinted to the door, her hands fumbling with the deadbolt, her fingers slipping on the metal. She threw it open just as the police were about to use the ram. The door swung wide to reveal two officers with guns drawn, their faces set in expressions of controlled aggression. Mark dropped to his knees. Tears began to run down his face. Real or performed, it was impossible to tell. He pointed at Elena, who was standing by the door, bleeding. "Officer, thank God." He held up his bandaged leg, and his voice cracked with simulated emotion. "She's out of control. Look what she did to me." Elena walked calmly to the lead officer. She handed him the recorder and the yellow insurance document with the name Marcus Vance printed across it. The recorder was still playing his voice. "She's so easy to break." The officer took the document and squinted at the name. He looked at Mark. He spoke into his radio, and the response came back. "We have a priority match on Marcus Vance. Multiple outstanding warrants. Approach with caution." Mark's face transformed in that instant. The victim mask fell away, and what remained underneath was predatory and cold. His eyes narrowed, and his mouth twisted into a snarl that showed all his teeth. The police tackled him before he could move. He hit the floor hard, and they cuffed him on the rug where Elena had been tied just minutes before. His face was pressed against the carpet, and his hands were wrenched behind his back. The ratchet click of the handcuffs was the sound of something finally being contained. 2 months later, Elena was sitting on a green park bench in a place where the sun was bright and the air smelled like cut grass and soil. She was wearing a yellow sundress, and her skin looked healthier than it had in years, the color returning to her face in small increments. She was holding a tablet computer, and on its screen was a news article. The headline read, "Serial Manipulator, Marcus Vance, sentenced to 20 years." There was a photograph of him from the courthouse, his expression stone-faced and lifeless. Underneath the headline, another article mentioned that Sarah, her former best friend, was also under investigation. She had been complicit in the manipulation, the gaslighting, the careful orchestration of Elena's isolation. There was a photo of Sarah leaving the courthouse, her face slack with the weight of consequence. Elena looked down at her car keys lying on the bench next to her. There were 2 key rings. One was her own key. The other was silver with a leather fob. And when she looked at it closely, she could see an engraving on the metal. "Property of Claire Roberts." She stood up from the bench. She walked to a nearby trash can and dropped the silver keyring inside. The keys made a clink sound as they hit the metal bottom of the bin. Elena walked away without looking back, her head held high, her shoulders relaxed. The sun was warm on her face, and ahead of her, the path through the park stretched out toward the light. The grass was green, the sky was blue, and she kept walking.